Right now, in the spring of 2025, something is happening in North America that the major networks have almost entirely ignored. And if you are within 10 years of retirement or already living on a fixed income, what you are about to hear in the next 25 minutes could directly affect the value of your savings, the price of your groceries, and the stability of the economic relationship that has underpinned American prosperity for 4 decades. Stay with this video until the very end, because the final revelation changes the entire picture in a way that almost nobody is discussing publicly. According to three sources familiar with Canadian Trade Ministry internal briefings, the United States' share of Canadian exports has now fallen to levels not recorded since the mid-1980s, before the Canada-United States Free Trade Agreement even existed. That agreement, signed in 1988, was supposed to lock both countries into permanent economic interdependence. What is happening right now suggests that the lock has been quietly picked, and most Americans have no idea it is occurring. If you find this kind of accountability journalism valuable, subscribe to this channel right now and hit the bell notification icon, because this story is developing rapidly and the next update could come within days. Let us begin with the numbers themselves, because the numbers are where the truth lives. According to data published by Statistics Canada and cross-referenced with reporting from the Financial Post and the Globe and Mail, the American share of Canadian merchandise exports dropped sharply through the first quarter of 2025. Multiple people briefed on the internal trade modeling coming out of Ottawa described the shift as, in their words, structural rather than cyclical. That distinction matters enormously. A cyclical shift is temporary, driven by seasonal demand or short-term price fluctuation. A structural shift means the underlying architecture of the trade relationship is being rewired, and rewiring takes years, sometimes decades, to reverse. To understand why this is happening, you need to go back to the beginning of 2025, and you need to understand the sequence of events with precision, because the sequence is everything. On February 1st, 2025, the United States announced broad tariff measures targeting Canadian goods, including a blanket 10% tariff on most imports and a 25% tariff on steel and aluminum. The announcement came without the extended negotiation period that had historically preceded major trade actions between the two countries. According to reporting from Reuters and the Wall Street Journal, Canadian government officials learned the full scope of the measures less than 48 hours before the public announcement. That is not a negotiating posture between allies. That is a unilateral declaration. The Canadian government's response came in two phases. The first phase was retaliatory tariffs on approximately $155 billion worth of American goods, targeting politically sensitive categories with surgical precision: orange juice from Florida, bourbon from Kentucky, motorcycles from Wisconsin and Pennsylvania. These were not random selections. They were designed by trade strategists in Ottawa to apply maximum political pressure on specific congressional districts, a tactic Canada had used successfully during the softwood lumber disputes of the early 2000s. The second phase, which received far less coverage in American media, was the beginning of a systematic effort to reduce Canadian economic exposure to the United States over the medium and long term. This is where the story becomes genuinely important for anyone watching this video, and it is the part that nobody in mainstream commentary seems willing to examine with the seriousness it deserves. If you are finding this breakdown useful, please hit the like button right now. It takes 2 seconds, and it tells the algorithm that this kind of detailed, source-driven analysis deserves a wider audience. Now let us continue, because what happened next is remarkable. In March 2025, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney, a former central banker who ran both the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England and who understands international capital flows at a level of technical sophistication that almost no other political leader in the world can match, began a diplomatic offensive that was unprecedented in modern Canadian history. Within 6 weeks, he had visited the European Union headquarters in Brussels, held bilateral meetings with the leaders of Japan, South Korea, and Australia, and dispatched senior trade ministers to India and Mexico. According to three sources familiar with the diplomatic communications from this period, the explicit message in each of those meetings was identical. Canada is open to accelerating trade diversification, and Canada is serious. Now, there is a psychological dimension to this story that most analysis ignores, and it is crucial. Mark Carney is not a populist. He is not performing anger for domestic consumption. He spent 30 years in institutions that prize stability, predictability, and long-term thinking above almost everything else. When a figure with that psychology begins moving at this speed, in this many directions simultaneously, it means the assessment inside the Canadian government is that the disruption to the relationship with the United States is not a short-term problem to be managed, but a long-term reality to be adapted to. Multiple people briefed on internal cabinet discussions in Ottawa described the prevailing view as one of strategic recalibration rather than crisis response. That framing, strategic recalibration, is the key to understanding everything else that follows. Subscribe to this channel if you have not already done so, because what comes next in this script is the part that connects all of this directly to your financial life and the life of anyone you know who depends on American economic strength to protect their retirement. Here are the revelation points, laid out in sequence, because each one builds on the one before it. First revelation: the trade numbers being reported in most American media understate the shift because they focus on headline export volumes rather than market share. Canada is still trading with the United States in large absolute terms. But the share of Canadian exports going to American buyers versus buyers in other countries has dropped to its lowest point since before the Free Trade Agreement. That means the structural advantage the United States has enjoyed as Canada's default economic partner for 40 years is eroding, quietly, in the background, while political attention is focused elsewhere. Second revelation: the sectors experiencing the fastest diversification are precisely the sectors most important to American manufacturing. Energy, lumber, aluminum, and agricultural products are being rerouted through new supply agreements at a pace that would have seemed impossible 18 months ago. According to reporting from the Financial Times and internal analysis cited by the Globe and Mail, Canadian liquefied natural gas export capacity is being expanded with explicit priority given to Asian markets. New contracts with Japanese and South Korean buyers, some of them multi-decade agreements, were signed or initiated in the first quarter of 2025. Those contracts, once fully operational, represent Canadian energy supply that is structurally committed to non-American buyers for 20, 30, sometimes 40 years. Third revelation: the lumber and softwood sector, which has been a chronic source of trade tension between the two countries for decades, is now being reorganized in ways that could permanently reduce Canadian dependence on American homebuilding demand. According to three sources familiar with British Columbia provincial trade strategy, at least 4 major Canadian timber producers initiated or accelerated export agreements with European buyers during the first quarter of 2025. The timing is not coincidental. European housing and construction demand, driven partly by post-pandemic infrastructure programs, created an opening, and Canadian producers moved into it. If you are retired or near retirement and you own a home, pay attention here, because this third revelation has a direct connection to American housing costs and construction availability that almost nobody is drawing explicitly. When Canadian lumber faces barriers entering American markets, and when Canadian producers simultaneously find new buyers willing to pay competitive prices elsewhere, the American construction sector faces a supply constraint. Supply constraints in construction translate into higher materials costs. Higher materials costs translate into higher home prices and higher renovation costs. That chain of consequences is already visible in preliminary pricing data, and it is likely to intensify if the structural trade shift continues. Hit the like button again if you are following this. And leave a comment below. Do you think this trade shift is temporary and reversible? Or do you believe it represents a permanent change in the relationship? Your perspective matters, and the comments on this video are some of the best analytical discussion happening anywhere on this topic. Fourth revelation: the agricultural dimension of this story is the most politically sensitive and the least reported. Canada is one of the United States' largest markets for American agricultural exports, particularly dairy, poultry, and processed food products. As the Canadian government has pursued retaliatory measures and simultaneously worked to diversify its own agricultural export markets, there is growing pressure within Canadian policy circles to reduce agricultural import dependence on the United States as well. Multiple people briefed on Canadian Agricultural Ministry planning describe an accelerated review of domestic production capacity in categories currently dominated by American imports. If that review produces policy action, and according to sources familiar with the internal timeline, it is expected to produce recommendations by mid-2025, American agricultural exporters could face meaningful new barriers in a market they have long taken for granted. Fifth revelation: the financial markets have not fully priced in what is happening. This is perhaps the most important revelation of all for anyone managing retirement savings or watching a 401k. The Canadian dollar, the performance of Canadian equities, and the pricing of cross-border financial instruments all continue to reflect, to a significant degree, the assumption that the Canada-United States trade relationship will return to something close to its pre-tariff baseline within a relatively short time frame. According to analysis from 3 independent economists cited in reporting from Bloomberg and the Financial Post, that assumption is increasingly difficult to sustain given the pace and depth of the structural changes being implemented on the Canadian side. Markets that are slow to reprice structural shifts tend to reprice them suddenly and sharply when the new reality becomes impossible to ignore. That repricing, when it comes, will affect American investors with Canadian exposure and Canadian investors with American exposure, and the interconnectedness of North American capital markets means the effects will not stay neatly on one side of the border. Sixth revelation: there is a generational dimension to this story that adds a layer of urgency almost entirely absent from current media coverage. The Canadians who are making these trade decisions, the ministers, the trade negotiators, the provincial economic strategists, are largely between 40 and 60 years old. They grew up in a Canada that had already internalized the lesson of the 1980s trade negotiations, that economic dependence on a single partner, however friendly that partner might be in normal times, is a strategic vulnerability. The generation now making decisions in Ottawa did not experience the pre-free trade agreement era as adults, but they studied it. They know that the integration of the two economies after 1988 was a political choice, not an economic inevitability. And they are now making a different political choice, with clear eyes and substantial institutional resources behind them. This is the moment in the analysis where the broader significance comes into focus, and it is worth slowing down to make sure the full weight of it lands properly. The Canada-United States trade relationship is not just the largest bilateral trade relationship in the world by volume. It is the foundational assumption underneath enormous parts of American industrial and consumer economic life. American manufacturers built supply chains assuming Canadian inputs would always be available at integrated market prices. American consumers benefit from Canadian energy, Canadian lumber, Canadian agricultural products, and Canadian manufactured goods at prices that reflect decades of tariff-free or low-tariff access. American retirees in states from Michigan to Montana to Maine live in communities where cross-border economic activity is woven into the basic fabric of local employment and commerce. If the structural shift in Canadian trade orientation continues at its current pace, the downstream effects on all of those communities and all of those individuals will be real, tangible, and lasting. Subscribe to this channel now and follow us on the platform linked in the description below, because this story is not ending. It is beginning. The trade policy decisions being made in Ottawa and Washington right now will determine the economic landscape that American retirees navigate for the next decade. You deserve analysis that takes that seriously, and this channel is committed to providing it. Now let us look at the scenario models, because responsible analysis does not just describe what is happening. It maps the range of possible outcomes with realistic probability assessments. Scenario 1, which independent analysts assign a probability of roughly 35%, is gradual normalization. In this scenario, political pressure from American agricultural exporters, manufacturers, and border state governors produces a negotiated reduction of tariffs within 12 to 18 months. The structural diversification moves Canada made in 2025 remain partially in place, but do not deepen significantly, because the economic incentive to trade with the geographically proximate American market reasserts itself once tariff barriers are reduced. The long-term damage to the relationship is real but manageable. Scenario 2, assigned a probability of approximately 40% by the same analysts, is asymmetric adaptation. In this scenario, Canada successfully deepens its trade relationships with European, Asian, and other Western Hemisphere partners enough to meaningfully reduce its economic vulnerability to American policy decisions, while continuing to trade with the United States at a reduced but still substantial level. The United States, in this scenario, loses its position as Canada's default economic partner without fully recognizing the loss until the new arrangements are too entrenched to easily reverse. This is the scenario most consistent with the pace and direction of what is actually happening right now. Scenario 3, assigned a probability of roughly 15%, is accelerated decoupling. In this scenario, additional American tariff actions or political confrontations over issues including sovereignty, defense spending, or resource access push the Canadian government to formalize its diversification strategy into explicit policy commitments that make partial reversal politically and economically very difficult. The multi-decade energy contracts, the deepened European lumber agreements, and the reduced agricultural import dependence all lock in simultaneously, and the structural shift becomes effectively permanent within 5 to 7 years. Scenario 4, assigned a probability of approximately 10%, is renegotiated integration. In this scenario, the tariff confrontation ultimately produces a new bilateral trade framework that replaces or substantially revises the existing United States-Mexico-Canada agreement, reflecting a more explicit and reciprocal acknowledgement of mutual dependence. This scenario would require significant political will on both sides and would likely only emerge from a period of economic pain that makes the costs of continued confrontation undeniable to decision-makers in both capitals. Here is the question that should be sitting at the center of every conversation about American economic policy right now, and it is the question this channel will continue to pursue with every resource at its disposal. Is the United States treating its most important economic relationship with the long-term strategic seriousness that relationship deserves, or is it applying short-term political logic to a partnership whose value is so deeply embedded in American economic life that its erosion will only be fully understood after it is too late to easily reverse? Leave your answer in the comments and share this video with someone you know who deserves to understand what is actually happening, because the numbers nobody is talking about have a way of becoming the crisis everybody is scrambling to explain, and it is always better to understand them first. This channel exists to make sure you are never caught off guard by the stories that matter most. Subscribe, hit the bell, and stay close, because the next chapter of this story is already being written in trade ministries and cabinet rooms on both sides of the border, and you will want to know what it says the moment it becomes clear.